Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. My name is Bruce. When my wife of 3 years called my masculinity toxic for so long, I grew tired and became the man she demanded. She wasn't expecting what happened next. I need you to understand something from the start. I loved Amanda deeply. Maybe I loved her too much, if that's even possible. That love made me willing to tear down every part of myself to keep the peace in our home. If you want the truth about what happened when I became exactly what my wife said she wanted, then stick around. The defining moment of my 3-year marriage happened on a Tuesday evening when I came home late from work again. I had been at the office working to close a significant deal with a client we'd been pursuing for months. It was a contract worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue. There was a back-and-forth conversation in which I had to push back hard on their demands, and moments when I had to be firm and refuse to bend on specific terms because I knew we'd be getting a bad deal otherwise. But I finally got them to sign. I was exhausted when I walked through our front door around 8:30 that night. I wanted to share that win with my wife, Amanda. But when I saw her, I could tell almost immediately that something was wrong. I asked her what was wrong as I sat down next to her. She turned to me, and she said she was fine. I saw resentment building up in her eyes. Later that night, she didn't ease into it as she decided to express herself. She told me that she has not been happy since we got married because a series of things had compounded. She claimed that my toxic masculinity was suffocating her. She said I worked too hard without considering her. She also had concerns about other aspects of our lives, saying I was too controlling about our finances and that every time she bought something for herself, I made her feel guilty by asking questions or suggesting we should save more. She said I was too traditional in my thinking, acting like we were living in the 1950s with my ideas about how a marriage should function. She said she felt like she couldn't breathe, as if I was forcing my worldview on her and not allowing her space to be herself. I sat there listening to all of this, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. I tried to defend myself by explaining that spending time at my job was necessary because it enabled us to afford our lovely house, our vacations, and the comfortable life we had. I told her that my concern about finances wasn't about controlling her, but about us having goals. We discussed saving for a down payment on a bigger house and starting a family in a few years. Those things needed financial discipline, and I was trying to keep us on track. As for being traditional, I explained that I never forced any roles on her. I naturally took charge of certain things because when I didn't, she seemed overwhelmed and stressed. I was trying to make her life easier, but Amanda wasn't listening to any of it. She cut me off and said I was making excuses and justifying behavior that made her feel small and controlled. She asked if I could change because she needed me to evolve into a more modern man, someone who was sensitive, emotionally available, and didn't try to dominate every situation. She said she felt like she was living with someone from a different era, someone who didn't understand that relationships are supposed to be equal partnerships, where both people have a say. I sat there feeling hurt and exhausted, not just from that conversation, but from years of similar criticisms. This wasn't the first time she'd brought these things up. Over the past year, there had been countless smaller arguments where she'd accused me of being too this or too that. I tried to adjust, tried to be more sensitive, tried to ask her opinion more often, but apparently it wasn't enough. In that moment, something inside me just quietly broke in a resigned way. I was tired of being criticized for qualities I believed were good. I was exhausted from feeling like I had to apologize for being capable, driven, and responsible. So I looked at Amanda, and I made a decision. I told her, fine. You want evolved? I'll give you evolved. She looked at me like she wasn't sure what I meant, but I could see a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, as if she thought she'd finally gotten through to me. She had no idea what I was actually planning. Over the next 2 weeks, I gradually began to dismantle every part of myself that Amanda had criticized. I started with the work situation since that was a significant issue for her. She didn't like that I worked long hours and came home after dark. So I decided to remove that from the equation entirely. I scheduled a meeting with my boss and told him I wanted to step down from my position. You should have seen his face. He asked me if I was serious, if something was wrong, or if there was a problem he didn't know about. I kept it vague and told him I needed a better work-life balance, that the stress of my role was affecting my personal life, and that I wanted to move into a less demanding role. He tried to talk me out of it. He reminded me that I was on track for a promotion within the next year or two, and that stepping down would essentially kill my upward trajectory. I told him I understood all of that, but my decision was final. After a lot of back and forth, he finally agreed. He moved me into a less demanding position. It was a job that paid less than what I had been earning, but the trade-off was a strict 9-to-5 schedule with the option to work from home 3 days a week. When I told Amanda about the change, she seemed genuinely pleased. She hugged me and said she was proud of me for prioritizing our relationship. She mentioned it would be nice to have me home more. I noticed she didn't ask about the pay cut, and I didn't bring it up. I figured she'd find out soon enough. Next, I addressed the issue of being too controlling with our finances. Throughout our marriage, I had been the one managing our money. I paid all the bills, monitored our bank accounts, tracked our spending, and worked on our savings and investments. It wasn't because I didn't trust Amanda or thought she was incapable. It was simply something I was good at and enjoyed. I'm naturally organized and detail-oriented, so handling finances came easily to me. However, Amanda had always been resistant to this arrangement. Whenever she'd buy something expensive, I'd notice it on our credit card statement and ask her about it. However, she saw those questions as me policing her spending or trying to control what she could and couldn't buy. So, I decided to step back from that role entirely. I went online and changed all of our bank accounts to list her as the primary account holder. I forwarded all our bills, mortgage, car payment, utilities, credit cards, everything, to her email. I also gave her the login information for our investment accounts and savings account. Then, I sat down with her and told her that from now on, she would be in charge of all our finances. I told her I didn't want to be controlling anymore, and that I trusted her completely to manage our money however she saw fit. She looked surprised and asked if I was sure. I smiled and said, absolutely, that's what she wanted, and I was happy to give her that autonomy. I could see she was a little nervous about it, but also pleased that I was finally letting go of control. What she didn't realize was that I was also letting go of responsibility. If bills didn't get paid, that was on her. If we went into debt, that was on her. If our savings disappeared, that was on her. I wasn't going to monitor anything or offer guidance unless she specifically asked for it. Finally, I addressed the issue of being too traditional. Amanda had accused me of imposing traditional gender roles on our marriage, such as always taking charge and making decisions without consulting her. So I stopped making decisions altogether, about anything. When she'd ask me where I wanted to go for dinner, I'd say, whatever you think is best, honey. When she'd ask what I wanted to do on the weekend, I'd say, I'm happy with whatever you decide. When her mother called to ask when we were coming to visit, I'd tell Amanda, you handle it however you want. When something broke around the house, I'd mention it to her and ask what she wanted to do about it, instead of just fixing it myself like I used to. Every decision, big or small, I deferred to her. At first, she seemed to like this. She interpreted it as me finally respecting her opinions and treating her as an equal partner. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't treating her as an equal. I was treating her as the only partner. I had completely checked out of the decision-making process. I had become a passive observer in my own life, and I was doing it on purpose. I was giving Amanda exactly what she said she wanted, and I was curious to see how long it would take for her to realize that what she said she wanted and what she actually needed were two very different things. Within the first month of this new dynamic, I felt almost liberated for both of us, at least on the surface. I was home much more because of my new role. I'd finish work at 5, close my laptop, and be done for the day. No more late-night emails, no more stress about hitting targets or closing deals. I was calm, relaxed, and always agreeable. Amanda initially seemed happier. She'd come home from her job as a marketing coordinator and find me already there, cooking dinner or watching TV. We'd talk about her day, and I'd listen, nod, and offer supportive comments without the work stress that used to distract me or make me short-tempered. We went to restaurants she chose, usually trendy places that were more expensive than the ones I would have picked. But I never said anything. We watched shows she wanted to see, even the mind-numbing reality TV stuff I found dull. We made plans around her schedule, visiting her friends and family, without me suggesting we balance it with my side. I played the role of the evolved, modern man perfectly. I was accommodating, passive, supportive, never challenging or questioning anything she wanted. And for those first few weeks, Amanda seemed to think this was great. She'd tell her friends about how I had changed, how I was finally showing more respect for her autonomy, how our relationship had gotten better. But I noticed small cracks starting to show, little signs that things weren't as perfect as she liked to believe. The kitchen faucet started leaking about 3 weeks into my transformation. It was a small leak at first, just a steady drip you could hear when the house was quiet. The old me would have gone to the hardware store that same day, bought the parts one needed, and fixed it within an hour. I'm handy like that. I grew up helping my dad with home repairs, so I know my way around basic plumbing and carpentry. But the new me didn't do that. Instead, I mentioned it to Amanda one evening while we were making dinner. I said, "Hey, the faucet's leaking. What do you want to do about it?" She looked at it, frowned, and said she'd call a plumber. I said okay, and left it at that. Days went by, then a week, then 2 weeks. The leak got worse, going from a drip to a small but steady stream. Amanda never called a plumber. I'd see her look at the faucet with annoyance, but she never followed through on getting it fixed. Eventually, we just put a bucket under the leak to catch the water. I'd empty the bucket when it got full, but I never offered to fix the problem myself. I was waiting to see how long it would take for her to either fix it or ask me to. She did neither. Around the same time, bills began arriving with late payment notices. I'd see them in the mail, red envelopes with urgent or past due printed on them. Amanda had never managed bills before, and she was struggling to keep track of what needed to be paid and when. Some bills were on autopay, some weren't, and she couldn't remember which was which. Our credit card statement came, and I glanced at it before she filed it away. There were charges I'd never seen before, a $300 handbag from some designer brand, a $200 skincare set, a $400 spa package. In the past, I would have asked her about these purchases, not to shame her, but just to understand what was going on with our spending. But now I said nothing. When she asked me one evening if we could afford to book a weekend trip to a bed and breakfast she'd seen online, I just smiled and said, "You're managing the money now, so it's your call." I could see something flicker across her face, uncertainty, maybe a little frustration, but she didn't push back. She booked the trip, and I could see her mentally calculating whether we could actually afford it. The confidence she'd had in the beginning was starting to crack, and I could tell she was feeling the weight of being the sole decision maker. But she wasn't ready to admit it yet. By the second month, the consequences of my transformation became impossible to ignore. Our savings account, which had held nearly $15,000 when I handed over financial control, had dwindled down to less than $3,000. I checked it one day out of curiosity, and a knot formed in my stomach when I saw the balance. $12,000 gone in about 6 weeks. Amanda's spending had continued unchecked. Online shopping had become her go-to stress relief, and without me gently questioning her purchases or suggesting we stick to a budget, she had no brake system. The charges added up fast, and she was dipping into savings to cover the gap between what we were earning and what we were spending. I said nothing. I'd committed myself to not intervening unless she specifically asked for help, and she hadn't. The house started to deteriorate in small but noticeable ways. The old me would have fixed all these things. But instead, I asked Amanda whether she wanted me to fix it or hire someone. She said she'd hire someone to fix it properly, but weeks went by, and she never did. Our lawn became overgrown and weedy because I stopped taking the initiative to mow it. I used to mow every Saturday morning without being asked. It was just part of my routine. But now, I waited for Amanda to ask me to do it. She rarely remembered, and when she did, it was usually after the grass had gotten so long that it looked embarrassing compared to our neighbors' yards. At work, my reduced income was becoming a real problem. We'd been living comfortably on my previous salary. We weren't rich, but we had enough to cover our bills, save money, go on vacations, and not stress about everyday expenses. But now I was making less, and Amanda's salary as a marketing coordinator was even less. Combined, we were bringing in just under $100,000, which sounds like a decent amount until you factor in that we'd been spending like we made more than that. Our mortgage, our car payments, insurance, utilities, groceries, gas, it all added up fast. And with Amanda's unchecked spending on top of our regular expenses, we were now spending more than we earned each month. The math didn't work, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Amanda started to feel the stress of being the financial decision-maker. She'd come to me with questions about which bills to prioritize if we couldn't pay everything. She'd ask if we should dip into what was left of our savings to cover the shortfall. She'd ask what we should do about the mounting credit card debt, which had accumulated because she'd been putting purchases on credit without paying the full balance each month. And every time she asked, I'd respond with the same maddeningly calm statements. I trust whatever you decide, honey. Or, you're doing great. I have complete faith in you. Or, it's your call. You're in charge of the finances now. I could see the frustration building in her eyes every time I said these things. She couldn't complain outright because this is what she'd once demanded, and now felt like abandonment. She didn't want autonomy anymore. She wanted help. She wanted me to take charge and fix the problems that were piling up. But I wasn't going to do that. Not yet. Not until she admitted that she'd been wrong about what she actually needed from me. By the 4th month, I started watching Amanda come apart at the seams. She'd stand in the kitchen for 10 minutes, staring at the refrigerator, trying to figure out what we should eat for dinner. I'd be sitting at the table, and she'd turn to me with this exhausted look and ask what I wanted. I'd smile and say, whatever you think is best, honey. I'm good with anything. She'd sigh, turn back to the fridge, and eventually order takeout because making a decision felt like too much work. This happened almost every night. The woman who'd accused me of being too controlling now couldn't even decide between chicken and pasta without it feeling like a massive burden. It wasn't just dinner. It was everything. The check engine light came on in our car, and Amanda asked me whether we should take it to the mechanic or wait. I told her it was her call since she was managing our money now. She stared at me for a long moment, clearly wanting me to tell her what to do, but I didn't. I just smiled and said I trusted her judgment. She decided to wait, hoping it was nothing serious, but you could see the stress on her face every time she got in the car, wondering if she'd made the right choice. A bill would come in the mail, and she'd ask if it was urgent or if we could pay it next month. I'd shrug and say, you're doing great with the finances. I'm sure you'll figure it out. She'd look at me like she wanted to scream, but she'd just nod and add it to the growing pile of papers on the coffee table. Every single decision, big or small, landed on her shoulders, and she wasn't built for it. I don't mean that as an insult. Some people thrive on making decisions, and some people don't. Amanda had always been more comfortable when someone else took the lead, but she'd convinced herself that my leadership was oppression. Now she was learning the hard way that freedom without structure is just chaos. She'd ask me questions constantly, looking for guidance, for direction, for me to take something off her plate. But I'd give her the same calm, supportive, completely useless responses. I trust you. Whatever you think is best. You've got this. And every time I said those things, I could see the frustration building in her eyes. About halfway through the month, she started snapping at me. We'd be sitting on the couch, and she'd suddenly turn and accuse me of not caring anymore. She'd say I'd checked out of the marriage, that I was going through the motions, but wasn't really present. I'd stay calm and remind her that I was simply respecting her independence and not being controlling like she'd said I was. I'd point out that I was home more than ever, that I was agreeable and supportive, that I was giving her exactly what she'd asked for. She couldn't argue with that logic, so she'd go quiet, but the resentment in her eyes was impossible to miss. She'd look at me like I was a stranger, like the man she married had disappeared and been replaced by some passive robot who just agreed with everything. Our social life completely died during this time. Before all this, I used to plan everything. I'd book restaurants for date nights, surprises, organize game nights with our friends, and buy tickets to concerts or shows she'd mentioned wanting to see. I took pride in making sure we had a life outside of just work and home. But now I did none of that. I'd come home from work, and we'd sit on the couch in silence, scrolling through our phones. One night, Amanda asked why we never did anything fun anymore. She said it felt like we were roommates, not a married couple. I looked at her and said I didn't want to be too traditional or controlling about our social calendar. If you want to plan something, I'm happy to go along with whatever you choose. She stared at me for a long time, and I could see her trying to figure out if I was being sincere or if I was messing with her. I kept my face neutral, supportive even. She eventually said she'd plan something. A week later, she organized a dinner with 2 of our couples of friends at a downtown restaurant. She had to pick the date, call our friends to coordinate schedules, choose the restaurant, make the reservation, and figure out transportation since she wasn't sure about the car situation. By the time the dinner actually happened, she was exhausted. She told me later that night that planning one dinner had taken so much mental energy that she couldn't imagine doing it regularly. I just nodded and said she'd done a great job, that our friends had a wonderful time. She didn't plan anything else after that. The worst part, though, was what happened to our intimate life. Before this experiment, I was the one who initiated everything. I'd pull Amanda close when we were watching TV, kiss her neck when she was doing dishes, and surprise her with affection throughout the day. I made her feel wanted, desired, pursued. That was just who I was. But now I have stopped all of it. I didn't touch her unless she touched me first. I didn't initiate intimacy. I didn't flirt or tease or make her feel like I couldn't keep my hands off her. I was polite, friendly even, but completely neutral. It took about 2 weeks before she noticed. One night, she came out of the bathroom in lingerie, clearly trying to get my attention. I looked up from my phone, smiled, and said she looked nice, then went back to scrolling. She stood there for a moment, confused, then asked if I was coming to bed. I said I'd be there in a bit. She went to bed alone that night. A few days later, she confronted me directly. She asked why I never touched her anymore, why I seemed utterly uninterested in her physically. I could see the hurt in her eyes, the confusion. I explained calmly that I didn't want to be too aggressive or make her feel pressured. I reminded her that she'd criticized me in the past for being too physical, too demanding, too traditional in expecting intimacy in our marriage. I told her I was trying to respect her boundaries and let her take the lead. She didn't know what to say to that. She just stood there, looking at me like I'd slapped her. She eventually said that wasn't what she meant, that she didn't want me to stop pursuing her entirely. I shrugged and said I was just trying to be the evolved man she'd asked for, someone who didn't impose his desires on her. After that conversation, things got even more tense. Amanda would sometimes try to initiate, but there was this hesitation in her, like she wasn't sure if I even wanted her anymore. And honestly, I wasn't sure either. Not because I didn't find her attractive, but because I'd spent 4 months suppressing every instinct I had. I'd turned myself into this passive, agreeable version of a man, and it had killed something inside me. Amanda could sense it, too. She'd look at me sometimes with this expression that was part sadness, part anger, part desperation. She was starting to realize that the man she demanded I'd become wasn't the man she actually wanted. But she didn't know how to say that without admitting she'd been wrong, and her pride wouldn't let her do that yet. By the end of the 4th month, our house felt like a pressure cooker. The bills were piling up, the house was falling apart, our social life was non-existent, and we barely touched each other. Amanda was drowning under the weight of all the decisions and responsibilities she'd demanded control over, and I was just watching it happen with this calm detachment. Part of me felt bad for her. I could see she was struggling, and the old me would have stepped in immediately to fix everything. But the new me just kept giving her space to figure it out on her own. I told myself I was respecting her autonomy, but deep down, I knew I was teaching her a lesson. I was showing her exactly what life looked like without me taking charge, and it wasn't pretty. The 5th month is when everything came crashing down, and honestly, I knew it was coming. I'd seen the warning signs for weeks, but I didn't say a word. The car payment notices had been arriving in the mail, first friendly reminders, then more urgent letters with bold red text saying final notice and immediate action required. They'd sit in that pile of papers on the coffee table, and I'd see Amanda shuffle through them sometimes, but she never asked me about them. She was too overwhelmed even to process what she was looking at. I'd watch her set them aside, telling herself she'd deal with it later, and I'd just go back to whatever I was doing. I didn't remind her. I didn't offer to help. I didn't handle the bills the way I would have before. I just let it play out. The day it happened, I came home from work around 5:30. It was a Thursday, and I remember the weather was nice. I saw her sitting on the front steps of our house, hunched over with her face in her hands. For a second, I thought something terrible had happened, as someone had died. Then I looked at the empty spot where our SUV usually sat, and I understood immediately. The repo truck had come. The car she mostly used was gone. I got out and walked up the driveway slowly, and Amanda looked up at me. She looked destroyed. But there was something else in her expression, too, something that caught me off guard. She had unfiltered rage directed right at me. I stopped a few feet away and asked what happened, even though I already knew. She just stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to find the words. Then she exploded. She screamed at me, asking how I could let this happen. She said the tow truck had shown up an hour ago, that the driver had been polite but firm, that he'd hooked up our SUV and driven away while the neighbors watched. She said she'd missed 3 payments, that she'd been juggling so many bills she'd lost track of which ones were on autopay and which ones she had to pay manually, and the car had slipped through the cracks. Then she asked how I could just watch our life fall apart and do nothing. She said I'd seen the notices, I'd known we were behind, and I'd said nothing. She accused me of sabotaging her, of setting her up to fail, of being cruel and vindictive. I just stood there, letting her get it all out, staying completely calm. When she finally ran out of steam, I reminded her, in the same even tone I'd been using for months, that she'd called my involvement in our finances controlling. I pointed out that she'd wanted complete autonomy over our money, and that she'd accused me of not trusting or respecting her independence. I told her I was simply giving her what she'd asked for, that I was respecting her ability to handle things on her own. I said I didn't want to be controlling, so I'd stayed out of it. The look on her face when I said that is something I'll never forget. It was like I'd reached into her chest and ripped something out. All the fight drained out of her in an instant, and she just collapsed. She kept saying she couldn't do this anymore, that she was drowning, that everything was falling apart, and she didn't know how to fix it. She said she tried so hard to keep up with everything, but it was too much. The bills, the house repairs, the decisions about what to prioritize and what could wait, the constant worry about money, all of it had crushed her. She admitted she'd been checking our bank account every day, watching the balance drop lower and lower, knowing we were spending more than we were making, but not knowing how to stop it. Then she looked up at me with tears and admitted she'd been wrong. She said she felt more secure when I was ambitious and in charge, that my so-called controlling nature had actually been protective. She said she'd never realized how much mental and emotional labor I'd been carrying until she had to handle it herself, and it was crushing her. She admitted that she'd killed the very thing that attracted her to me in the first place. She said she missed feeling pursued, feeling protected, and having a man take charge and make her feel safe. She said she didn't recognize me anymore, and she didn't identify herself either. She said we'd both become people she didn't like, and it was her fault. I stood there listening to all of this, and I felt this strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt vindicated, like I'd been proven right after months of being told I was the problem. Part of me felt sad, seeing the woman I loved broken down like this. And part of me felt angry, because it had taken our car being repossessed and our life falling apart for her to admit what I'd known all along, finally. I didn't say any of that, though. I walked into the house, and she followed. Later that night, she came to meet me. She promised me, right there on her knees, that she'd never criticize me for being me, as she understood now that those weren't character flaws. They were the qualities that held our life together. She said she'd been influenced by things she'd read online, by friends who complained about their husbands, by this cultural message that men who take charge are somehow oppressive. She said she'd bought into all of that without realizing it didn't apply to us, that our relationship worked differently, and that was okay. She begged me to forgive her, to give her another chance, to be myself again. I sat there looking down at my wife on her knees in front of me, and I felt this complicated tangle of emotions I couldn't quite sort out. Part of me wanted to pull her up immediately, hold her, tell her everything would be okay, and go back to being the man I'd always been. That was my instinct, my natural response to seeing her in pain. But there was another part of me, a part that had grown stronger over these 5 months, that held me back. I also realized that if I just immediately went back to being myself without any real change on her part, we'd end up right back here eventually. Maybe not in 5 months, maybe not in a year, but eventually. She'd start taking me for granted again. She'd start listening to her friends or reading articles about toxic masculinity, and she'd begin criticizing me again. The cycle would repeat because nothing would have fundamentally changed except that she'd temporarily learned how hard life was without me taking charge. That wasn't enough. I needed to know that she understood not just that she needed me, but that she needed to respect and appreciate me consistently, not just when things were falling apart. So I didn't immediately comfort her. I didn't pull her up or tell her everything was fine. I let the weight of the situation settle. Then I told her to get up and sit down next to me. She looked confused, but she did what I asked. She sat on the couch, waiting for me to say something. I could see the anxiety in her eyes, the fear that maybe I was going to tell her it was too late, that I was done. But that wasn't what I was going to say. I took a breath and told Amanda that I wasn't going to flip a switch and go back to being the old me. I explained that I'd learned that she'd taken me for granted, that she'd resented the very things about me that made our life work, and that if I just went back to normal without any real accountability on her part, we'd end up in the same place eventually. I told her I loved her, but I wasn't willing to go through this again. So if we were going to move forward, it had to be on different terms. I had conditions, and she needed to hear them and decide if she could accept them. I watched her face as I said this. She looked scared, but she nodded and told me to go ahead. So I laid out for her, point by point. First, I told her she would never again use terms like toxic masculinity to describe me or criticize my natural tendencies to lead, provide, and protect. I said if she had concerns about my behavior, she needed to communicate them respectfully, like an adult, and I'd do the same for her. But the constant criticism, the labeling, the making me feel like there was something wrong with me for being who I am, that had to stop permanently. I told her that language had done real damage to me, to us, and I wouldn't tolerate it anymore. She nodded, agreeing without hesitation. Second, I told her I would resume control of our finances, and she would not question my decisions about spending, saving, or budgeting. I said she could have input, she could share her thoughts and preferences, but the final decisions would be mine. I explained that I'd proven I was good at managing money, that our life had been stable and secure when I was in charge, and that the past 5 months had proven she didn't want that responsibility anyway. I said I wasn't trying to control her or limit her freedom, but someone had to be in charge of our finances, and it would be me. She nodded again, and I could see relief in her eyes at not having to carry that burden anymore. Third, I told her she needed to show me consistent respect and appreciation for what I brought to the marriage. I said I needed to hear that she valued my ambition, my provision, my leadership, not just when things were falling apart, but regularly. I told her I'd spent 3 years feeling like I was doing something wrong, like I was too much or not enough, and I wasn't going to live like that anymore. I needed to know that she saw my contributions, that she was grateful for them, and that she didn't take them for granted. I said this wasn't about needing constant praise or having my ego stroked. It was about basic respect and acknowledgement. She said she understood that she'd failed at that, and that she'd do better. Fourth, I told her we were going to embrace a more traditional dynamic in our marriage. I said I would lead and she would support, because that's what actually worked for us, regardless of what modern society, her friends, or the internet said we should be. I explained that I wasn't asking her to be some submissive housewife with no opinions or identity. Still, I was asking her to stop fighting against the natural dynamic that made both of us happier. I said when I led and she supported, we both thrived. When we tried to force some egalitarian model that didn't fit who we were, we both suffered. I told her I needed her to accept this, embrace it, and stop apologizing for or feeling guilty about it. She nodded, and for the first time in months, I saw something like peace in her expression. Fifth, and this was the most important one, I told her that if she ever reverted to her old patterns of criticism and resentment, I would walk away. I said it calmly, without anger or threat, just as a statement of fact. I explained that I wasn't going to diminish myself again to keep the peace, that I wasn't going to spend years being made to feel like there was something wrong with me for being a man who takes charge. I told her that if we couldn't make this work with mutual respect and clear roles, we were fundamentally incompatible, and that it would be better for both of us to move on. I said I wasn't looking for an exit, and I wasn't hoping for failure, but I needed her to understand that my presence in this marriage was a choice I made every day, not an obligation I was trapped in. I observed her face as I laid out that last condition, half expecting her to push back or get defensive. Instead, she just looked at me with this expression of understanding, like she finally got how serious this was. She didn't argue. She didn't try to negotiate. She just said she agreed to all of it, every single condition, without hesitation. She said she'd do whatever it took to have the real me back, that she understood she'd almost lost me, and that she wasn't going to make that mistake again. She reached out and took my hand, and I let her. We sat there for a while in silence, both of us processing what had just happened. Something had fundamentally shifted between us. The power dynamic had changed. I was no longer the man trying to prove himself or defend his nature. I was the man setting the terms, and she was the one agreeing to them. There are many men out there going through something similar, and hearing my experience may help them make sense of their own situation. Amanda has kept her word on every single condition I set. She's respectful and appreciative. She defers to my leadership without the constant pushback and criticism I dealt with for 3 years. Our intimate life is better than I ever thought it could be. She responds to me with this enthusiasm and desire that were completely missing before, and it's because she finally stopped fighting against what she actually wanted. But here's the thing nobody tells you about situations like this. Even though everything looks good on the surface, something inside me has changed permanently. Before all this, I loved her with this complete, self-sacrificing devotion. I would have done anything for her, changed anything about myself, endured any amount of criticism, because I thought that's what love required. But I learned the hard way, through all the debts and mismanagement, that kind of love isn't healthy. It's not sustainable. And it's not even what she actually wanted. Now, I love her with boundaries. I love her with the understanding that if she takes me for granted again, if she reverts to her old patterns, I'm gone. And I'm not saying that to be cold or harsh. I'm saying it because it's the truth. I know now that I'd be fine on my own, and I'm not willing to apologize for it or diminish it to make someone else comfortable. I think a lot about what I learned from this whole experience, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Modern culture has done a real number on men, especially men like me who have natural leadership qualities. We're told constantly that traditional masculine traits are toxic, and some men hear that message and just completely shut down. They become passive, agreeable, and afraid to take up space or have opinions or make decisions. I'm not saying toxic behavior doesn't exist. Of course it does. Men who are actually abusive, actually controlling in a harmful way, actually disrespectful to women. That's real, and it should be called out. But the pendulum has swung so far in the other direction that now any man who takes charge, has standards, or refuses to be passive is labeled as toxic. And that's not right. I want to say this directly to any man who's listening and going through something similar. Pay attention to whether your partner appreciates you for who you are or is constantly trying to change you into someone else. Please pay attention to whether she respects your instincts or resents them. Pay attention to whether she's grateful for your leadership and provision, or if she takes them for granted. Because love shouldn't require you to dismantle yourself. A woman who truly loves you will celebrate your strength, not try to diminish it. She'll feel safe in your leadership, not threatened by it. She'll be grateful for your provision, not resentful of it. And suppose you're with someone who's constantly criticizing you, continually telling you that who you are isn't good enough, and continuously demanding that you become more passive and agreeable. In that case, you need to evaluate whether that relationship is worth saving. I don't know if my marriage will last forever. I hope it will. I'm committed to making it work as long as Amanda continues to respect and appreciate what I bring. But I'm no longer attached to that outcome in an unhealthy way. I'm committed to being the best version of myself, the strongest, most capable, most authentic version. And if Amanda continues to value that, we'll build something powerful together. But if she reverts to taking me for granted and starts listening to her friends or the internet more than to her own experience, and if she starts criticizing me again for being who I am, I'll walk away with my head held high, with the understanding that we gave it our best shot and it just wasn't meant to be. Life's too short to spend it pretending to be someone you're not. Thanks for listening.